Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. Today, actually, I'm not going to have a conversation except to the degree that one can have a conversation with oneself or through oneself, because I'm not going to directly ask myself questions, because that's a little kooky. I mean, I do talk to myself on occasion, but I think there's nothing wrong with it. We all have voices in our head. That's one thing that's perfectly clear. But I will not be attempting to channel them directly today. Today is going to be the last show for the summer. As I've mentioned in a few previous episodes, I'm going to take a break over the next couple of months, partly because I'm so busy. I'm doing tons of travel, conferences, festivals, lots of talks, and doing a weekly show on top of that is a bit twisted. Challenging. And I also just wanted to take the time to step back and think about the show and how I want it to develop, which way I want it to go, whether to do something else, whether to refine in which way, whether to set up a Patreon, blah, 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 all these things that I've kind of mentioned before. People have probably tuned into a little restlessness on my part. But I've been doing the show, I can't remember the exact first date, but I'm pretty sure it was the fall of 2009. So it's basically been a decade. And I wanted to, reflect a little bit about the show and doing podcasting and what I was intending to do and how it developed and shifted, and then also probably talk a little bit about my new book, High Weirdness. And the two are actually kind of related, because the reason I started the podcast is that I've been a, whatever you want to call it, culture critic, cultural journalist since the late 1980s, professionally, and even before that in terms of stuff I did in college. And I always like to balance my academic work with stuff about popular culture. I came of age intellectually in the 1980s, when it was sort of the first wave of what we now call cultural studies. And that term has, changed a lot. I think it has very different meanings now, and it's bound up with certain identity politics that was always part of the picture, but in a different way than I think it was in the 80s. There was always a sort of Marxist materialist side to cultural studies, but it also just allowed people to go, hey, let's just look at this stuff and take it seriously, and combine our analytic aspirations with our juicy fandoms, and then just see how far this is going to go. So I was always really into cultural journalism and really enjoyed being a freelance writer in the late 80s and the 90s, and really through the early 2000s. And I've kept it up since then, occasionally doing pieces, but I did it quite a lot for a while. And, one of the things is you just get kind of used to it. You get a little addicted maybe to both having a kind of feedback relationship with what's happening in the now, the latest books, latest music, latest movies, latest events, new subcultures, the sort of desire to be part of the flow of history by commenting on it and writing about it. And it's particularly in my case, writing about things I thought were wonderful. I didn't write too many negative reviews. I wasn't that interested in being like a critic with a capital C. Instead, I would kind of write about things that inspired me. And sometimes probably I was as interested in the inspiration as in the actual artist. Sometimes people would go like, I listened to that heavy metal record you wrote about, and it wasn't as interesting as your piece. And I think it was partly because I just like to write through my resonances, through the things that stimulated me. But it's also a way of like keeping your hand in or being part of the conversation, even though, of course, it's mostly sitting alone at a desk. And of course, all that's shifted through the internet and the sense of communication, the sense of writing, the democratization of cultural criticism. I mean, everybody really is a music critic now. And so the idea that it's a separate role that you get paid for is kind of absurd, even though some people still make it work, and some of my friends are still at it, and I have a great admiration for them. But throughout the 2000s, I still like to write criticism, write journalism, even as I was working on books and other projects. And when it came time to go to when I decided to go in a PhD program, I said, okay, finally going to do it. I knew that I was going to be drawn into a lot more reading and writing in an academic mode. I wasn't going to have a lot of time to write journalism or write criticism. I did do a few things when I was at Rice, but I mostly was just like, it's just kind of a hassle. So wait, I know I got the gift of gab. I'm good on my feet. I've been giving talks since the early 90s and increasingly extemporaneously. So I was like, well, I'll just do a podcast. And, podcasts were already groovy at the time. And so I started talking to people, and it was it's been a wonderful way to, again, keep my hand in the sense that left to my own devices, I can get kind of hermetic, go down my own rabbit holes and personal tunnels. And there's something about the call to keep paying attention to what's coming out, not to just, fetishize the new. In fact, a lot of guests I've had didn't necessarily have some new, consumer commodity on the market, or they had done things years before and I was still interested in them, or I just discovered them myself, but just a way to kind of keep leaning out of one's own hermetic tendencies into conversation. And that was always really obvious to me that while I like doing interviewing, and obviously the show is partly about interviewing, I like the skill set of being able to kind of listen closely and sort of see where there are opportunities and little interesting points or alleyways in someone's speech, and going, oh, let's go down that way and see what lies there, and developing a sense of a connection even in the public sort of visible medium of an interview. But I always wanted to steer the interviews towards this idea of conversation, and partly was because I just wanted to talk too. Like, I wanted to say what my ideas were or what I was interested in. And early on, especially, people were sometimes get some negative feedback that I was just going on too much. And let's hear a little bit more of the guests, because they wanted more of the interview format. And, sometimes it was true. I'd listen back to things and I'd go, man, just shut up. Let's keep moving. So I think over the years, I've developed a better balance between, my own riffing and asking questions. But it wasn't just about riffing. It's more that when you're riffing and your conversation partner is riffing, then you find yourself in new places. And sometimes emotional places, sometimes conceptual places, sometimes new angles on things. And that was always the sort of drive of the show. Early on, I think in maybe within 2 years, maybe it was like 2011 or something, I had one conversation where this guy had written a book about, the future of consciousness and technology or whatever. And I read it, and I often knew a lot of people that I was talking to, and I have throughout the conversation. Most of the people on the show are either people I know or know that I would like to know, on a personal or at least peer-to-peer level. So it's been a way to kind of socialize as well in this kind of strange public format, both to keep up with people who I've lost touch with or I haven't talked to for years, who I met because of the work they do, or because I had interviewed them before, or we had mutual friends who were working or producing art or culture. So it was a way to keep up with people, and then also to weave new people into this kind of loose network of contacts, people that I might be able to call later or run into and have that sense of connection. But, I also just sort of throw the dice, and I'd see the book title and just intuitively choose to do it. And I tried to make my decisions about guests as informally and quickly and spontaneously as possible because, well, frankly, I wanted to spend as little time on the show as possible. That was the goal. I'm not getting any money. Let's just make it as spontaneous as possible. Book the guests quickly. I would read the books. That's the one thing that I wasn't too into being too superficial with. And then have the conversation, not a lot of prep, not a lot of questions written down, unless the guest is into it. Let's just start talking and trust that was going to go somewhere interesting. But in this one case, I kind of intuitively got this book, and it was a little businessy or kind of mainstream in a slightly suspicious way. And then when I got on the conversation, the dude was like 100% about talking points. He had clearly like studied, repeated himself over and over again with the set answers, and he did that thing that professional radio interviews do, where it doesn't matter what the question is, they just get to the talking point, and it's like this obvious gap where you're like, you're not actually listening to me, we're not having a conversation, this is like this scripted event, and it really pissed me off. I mean, I didn't get angry during the show, but I got like sort of just not, I was just kind of, if you knew me, you could tell that I wasn't into it anymore. But, hey, the guy's doing his thing. It was interesting enough. But after that, I was like, no more of that. So I was very wary about any kind of pop book that was just out, and they were on the tour. And then I would get more aggressive about asking questions that would break people from their scripts, although I usually didn't have to do that because I just got better at getting people who were interesting and wanted to actually talk rather than just shill. But that was a sort of interesting factor that came in pretty soon and clarified this desire I had to do conversation. And conversation isn't just about me being able to talk to, or having an opportunity to explore my own ideas because I would be interested in people because they were resonating with things that I was thinking of. But it's something deeper than that, and I think it's actually one of the reasons that podcasts remain, I think, one of the more hopeful aspects of our current media environment, and that is that when there are conversations, especially when they're unscripted. I'm not talking so much about the shows that are written and produced, like docudramas or whatever, or single person shows. I'm talking about all the conversations out there, that they model conversation. And conversation is one of those things we take for granted, but can actually leave our lives if we're not paying attention. We might exchange mouth noises with people, but not really have a conversation where you're asking each other questions that might be hard, that might require vulnerability, that might require saying, I don't know, or like, that's really confusing to me, or I still don't know what to think about that, and getting out of the mode of expertise that kind of slips into the podcast or to interview formats where like the interviewer is asking someone who's like an expert a question, and then there's this pressure to answer it. Even if the best answer is, I don't know, or I'm confused about that, or I have contradictory feelings about that. And unless we start doing that in a vulnerable but open-minded way, we're never going to get outside these ruts we're in. I'm not sure we are anyway, but one little, kind of small utopian gestures towards the possibility of people having a real conversation. Now, admittedly, I'm not bringing on people who have radically different political views, although often radically different ontological views. I have tried to have people on who are, conservative Christians or conspiracy theorists or paranormal advocates or super hardcore, atheist skeptics. And, I've always had some of those on, but usually it seemed a little better to have someone a little closer in affinity, and then kind of see where you can find places of exploration and vulnerability and questions through that mode. But I really believe that the modeling of conversation in a public way is an important part of maintaining public space, of maintaining I don't want to say consensus reality, but the sort of the public as an environment that we're all sharing in. And sometimes I feel like, wow, I've developed all these skills. Maybe the best thing for me to do is to try to find people who really are on the other side of any number of fences, who are harder for people like me to talk to, but who, if they're willing to actually have a conversation and not just spiral off into, anger and accusation, to do that, to, go around and just talk to conservatives or, but it's so complicated now because everything's so weaponized and so polarized that it's very difficult to do that kind of thing. And so the little bit that I've done, I'm happy about. But sometimes I think about the value of being more explicit about finding people on the other side of the fence who want to talk about things and explore mutual differences. And it would be fascinating, but it's in a way it's a lot more work. It's also a lot more dangerous and a lot more vulnerable. And while I think the vulnerability of podcasting is part of what's attractive to it, I'm not interested in radical vulnerability in the way that I don't trust our contemporary media environment enough for that. So in any case, there were some negative aspects of my desire to do the show quickly and spontaneously. Though it's been in general a good life lesson for me. I remember the first time I gave a public lecture. It was on Philip K. Dick. It was called Philip K. Dick's Postmodern Gnosis, very early 1990s. And I prepared. I didn't write it out. I didn't read it, but I prepared pages and pages and pages of quotes and like writing out the ideas and kind of referring to it throughout the talk. But then I noticed afterwards, I was like, I didn't really read it that much. I was mostly kind of riffing because I can do that. And then I was like, dude, if you get better at not preparing, that means the amount of time that you're going to put into giving talks is going to decrease, and that's more fun, or more laziness or sloth or slack or whatever. So that seemed appealing to me. So you kind of increase the risk because you could blow it, not knowing, oh gosh, I didn't write through that. So there's a little bit more of an edge, but then when it's working, it's a little bit more like jazz because you're riffing. And sometimes I'll say things that I hadn't planned to say, I hadn't never thought before. And sometimes I even forget them. I was like, wow, there was some brilliant thing I said 20 minutes into that talk. I should have written it down, and I'm not one to listen to myself afterwards. And that's actually part of the same loop. Just put it out there and just keep on cruising down the dusty road. And don't worry about it. Don't worry about, Alan Bishop from the Sun City Girls talked about that, because what they did, their underground sort of punk noise, psychedelic, ethno weirdo band, one of the great bands of the American underground. And they just put out tons of recordings in small runs. And that was how they did it. They put out 1,000 records, and then 2 weeks later another one, and they put out all these records, all these CDs, all these cassette recordings. And I asked Alan about that, and he was like, "Look, it's all about keeping going, not holding stock." He's like, I don't want boxes of records in my basement. I want to put it out there, and some of the stuff we put out was jewels, and some of it was pterodactyl shit, and we just keep going. And there's something about that I really liked, and I kind of adopted that for the podcast. But the obvious sign of that attitude that was, probably less than pleasant for many listeners, and actually a turnoff for some, was the poor sound quality that I allowed the show to possess long after I should have gotten my act together. I mean, part of it was just doing a show initially with Maja Daou, who was a great friend of mine, and someone I always wanted to do like a talk show with, because we had that kind of funny, side. She was like a funny sidekick style, and then always would ask questions from weird angles that I couldn't predict. And she was a little more woo than me, but also really punk rock and spunky, and just like a great personality, great character. And so we had a lot of fun, more than the first half of the show, doing the stuff together, but we were in different places. So there was already like some noise on the line because we were basically over the phone and we can't see each other and we're talking over each other. And then I just didn't really pay that much attention to all the good sound quality tools that were coming out. So, I feel a little bad about that. People still dive into the archive, and some people don't care, and some people do. And I mean, it was a little more intentional than that, actually, because people would start to complain about the sound quality, and I was like, well, yeah, I could fuss around with this and upgrade and get kind of more particular about it. But there's a part of me that also resists going too far down that path, because I think one of the good and bad things about the democratizing of media tools is that sort of initially there's this sense of like, wow, everybody can like explore a new way to use a new medium and do it in all sorts of ways. It's sort of like, like the Xerox machine can be a vehicle for a punk fanzine that's made out of like cutting up other Xeroxes and taping them together on a piece of paper and then putting them through the Xerox machine. Well, that's obviously not what it's designed for. But the problem is as the tools get better and as the tool makers out compete each other with features, there's a sort of unspoken pressure to make the tools more and more professional, slick, sounding high quality. And I totally respect sound quality and fetishes for sound quality. And I totally appreciate why some people were like, with my show, it's just too crappy. It exhausts me. I don't want to hear it. And it really wasn't until I was like, recognizing how many people listen to these things in earbuds, which I don't use, and how much of a drain that could be on people's attention, that I really sort of said, yeah, okay, let's get our act together. But it took me a while to do, and it was for a similar reason that I ultimately stepped aside from the conversations with Maja. I thought they were really a lot of fun. It kept me on my toes because I didn't know what she was gonna ask, and sometimes she'd ask things from left field, or my version of left field made sense to her. And it made for some really sprightly conversations and sometimes some kind of puzzling ones. But I loved doing it with her. But the technical aspect of talking over each other and whatever, and we just never upgraded to a more kind of face-to-face through Zoom or Zencastr or whatever to do that. So it ended up, it was just easier after a certain point to go my own way. And the conversations could go in directions that were more intimate to some of my obsessions. And so, it's been a really fun ride for all this stuff. And while I'm definitely interested in continuing it, people like the show, they like my approach. I can get away with this sort of small prep on my feet style, and so it doesn't take too much time. But there's something about the weekly grind of it that's getting a bit much. And also a lot of listeners have commented on the length of the show, and sometimes there's some anxiety at the end of the show because they know that it's ending, but we're middle of an interesting point. And there's a lot of reasons to extend things as well. Sometimes I've thought about doing shows with different focal point. So that's why I'm stepping back. Just give it some time, see what happens, read some feedback, and I've gotten so much great feedback over the years, and it, really does make a difference. Although that's worth kind of talking about a little bit. It's just the whole way of like judging the value of the show or the value of it as something in my life that I'm not getting paid for through feedback. And what's feedback? Numbers are feedback. Individual email is feedback. A package of totally bizarre mini zines in the mail is feedback. CDs that I hadn't asked for are kind of feedback. Lots of books now. I get a lot of books for free. A lot of them aren't things I'm interested in. But that's another kind, at least when they're not asked for, is a kind of feedback. And it's interesting, the tension between, I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago or even last week, the tension between quantitative and qualitative models of feedback. The whole game, like the big media thing is based so much on quantity, so much on numbers, because the numbers are really extraordinary. I mean, how much a kind of obscure YouTube channel can get, hundreds of thousands, a million, of hits or even subscribers for things that are just kind of peculiar or goofy or marginal in some sense. And, podcasts are a similar game, and some of the, top-notch characters get, really good numbers, and then they can translate that into a living. And that's pretty awesome. I didn't frankly look at my numbers for like 6 years. It was almost like a decision, like an abstract decision not to look at the numbers, so that I did not start judging myself or the quality of the show based on numbers. And my internal logic for this, I think, is still pretty coherent, which is that it goes like this, is like, there's some people out there who are, let's say, are making podcasts or writing things that I think are stupid They're bad. They have low ethical motivations. It's not funny. It's not intelligent. It's even pernicious in some ways. It's cheesy. It's easy, and it doesn't matter. I don't have to name anybody. I'm sure everyone hearing this can put your own figures in these various categories. And yet, if I look at characters like that, and then I go look at their numbers, I realize sometimes those numbers are very robust. So the fact that you have numbers, just like the fact that you have fans, says absolutely nothing about the quality of your work, the value of it. So for me, it was like, what's the point? Unless I actually want to change the show based on these numbers, and kind of start to like refine the feedback loop. So, more listeners if I do shows on psychedelics. Okay, I'm going to do more shows on psychedelics to get more listeners, which is what a lot of people do. Again, it's part of the game now of like creating a listenership or creating a fandom and then like feeding them what they want. And then that's more what you do as a cultural producer, because now you've got this growing horde of folks who follow you or listen to you or even buy your stuff or at least draw advertising to them and thereby to you. So I just didn't want to do that. And then connected with that is another idea, which is like, having people who just listen to you because they think you're cool is different than having people listen to you who need to listen to someone like this, who are thinking about similar things, struggling through similar things, and maybe sometimes in a way that's actually quite harrowing. And so I would rather have, 2 of those guys than 200 just like fans who are just like, oh, Erik Davis is cool. Whatever, who are like, yeah, wow, it's UFOs, psychedelics. It's all right, it's fine. I like everybody, or try, but so that also adds an interesting twist, and that has to do partly with the other side of my work, which is that in some ways I'm an intellectual and produce scholarly material. In other ways, I'm not, or at least I'm not a conventional intellectual, or I'm a public intellectual or a counter-public intellectual is how I kind of think of it, because I've never been interested in speaking directly to like the mainstream public. I've never had the aspiration to be like a recognizable face in the New York Times op-ed section, that kind of public intellectual. And there's tons of those guys. They get their authority or their job in the academy, and then they don't want to just stay in scholarship, and so they go towards the mainstream. I wanted to go towards the underground, but have some of that kind of academic skill set and richness as well. So then that also applies to how you do shows. And so I've always been into still doing things, occasionally having shows that are super nerdy, where I talk to scholars and we go for it. We're like in the soup, but it's not for academic audiences. And there's a lot of podcasts that are very focused on scholarship or people who have had certain kinds of training. And I always really wanted to like bring that stuff in, but remix it or use language in a different way, and kind of rely on the fact that when I'm speaking, I often kind of use slang, and I'm a little sloppy, and I make mistakes, and I'm not like a super I'm articulate, but I'm not really sharp. Like I know people who are like, they sound like they're reading, when they're talking. Mark Derry's a great example. I mean, the dude, he talks in like amazing prose, and he's just sharp. He's on top of all these phrases and subclauses, and I'm a sloppier style, but my sloppy style, I think, sometimes makes people feel at ease, and so we can go into some arcane places and continue the fun and openness. So I really started this whole show because I was going into a PhD program. So the PhD program and the podcast were kind of tied together from the beginning. And with the publication of High Weirdness, in a sense, basically a decade later, 9 years from when I entered Rice, the book version of my dissertation is out. So in some sense, this last decade chapter of my life is coming to a close, because I went in there. I always knew I wanted to write about Philip K. Dick. I always had my plan and plot from the get-go. A lot of times in grad school, a lot of what the kind of social conversation is about. People, what project they're going to do their thesis on, and then they change their ideas and change their mind drastically, maybe get a different advisor. That's a lot of like, and there's a lot of anxiety. Am I going to do this? Am I going to do that? And I always knew what I was going to do. So obvious. Philip K. Dick, religious experience, 2374, exegesis, gravy. I got to work on the exegesis around the time that I was, just before I was going to go to PhD program. And so I knew that this book was coming out and that people would pay attention to it, or at least some people, and that I had, already read it a couple times and gotten nitty gritty with it. So it was just all set for me. But even though that was always my plan, just to do the exegesis in 2374 and the nature of religious experience, yada, yada, I had the whole thing plotted out. Like, I had a Scrivener file and all the different chapters and sub-chapters and gathering all the kind of a lot of the quotations and huge number of selections from the exegesis. And then just at the last minute, I quavered. I went, no, I don't want to do this. I don't want to have a project that's just on Philip K. Dick. I talk about this a little in the introduction to High Weirdness. There are two main reasons. One is that I think I had a psychic, like a little medical shaman kick in that was like, do not spend the next 4 years of your life inside Philip K. Dick's brain with no relief. There was something about getting lost in the matrix of rabbit holes that is the exegesis that kind of stilled my soul. But more important than that, it was the sense that, for one thing, there was a lot of attention on Phil Dick, even though there hadn't been that much attention on the religious stuff or the religious side of the story, but it was more and more. But also the sense that no matter how interesting and how profound and how novel my discoveries in writing were, it was still about this one very peculiar guy. So if you weren't into this one very peculiar guy, peculiar, brilliant guy, then it didn't really have much play. It didn't really connect outside of that. And it also kind of remained about the singular personality. But as I was doing the research for 2374 and thinking about it not just in terms of Phil Dick's life, but also in terms of the early 70s, which is a period of time I've always been fascinated with since my undergraduate years, when some friends and I were all very into the 70s, and we did like a zine on the 70s, and nobody was talking about the 70s at that point because it was the mid 80s. It was like too soon. And I've always been interested in the period and collect things from the period and listen to a lot of music from the period, a lot of films, et cetera, et cetera. So it's always been an interest of mine. So I was thinking about Dick's 2374 through this whole question of like the 70s. What's the 70s? What is it about? And then in so doing, I had to acknowledge that there were these other experiences that people were having at that time. And Robert Anton Wilson's Sirius transmissions were obvious, as well as the Tim Leary's similar extraterrestrial communications that he had while he was in prison. I had remembered that there was a fascinating story that Lily tells about being on a plane in 1973 or 74 and having the solid state intelligence tell him they were going to like demonstrate their power by shutting down the airport. And then the pilot comes on and says, we're going to have to land at a different airport, which seems to have been a true or true-ish story. Of course, Lily was on ketamine at the time, but there was a sort of diverted aircraft around the time when he was saying that was headed towards LAX. So who knows what's actually going on there, but it seems real enough. In any case, there were more and more of these stories, and of course also Terence McKenna's tale. And what was interesting about these tales is that they shared a lot of features. There was some science fictional element, a kind of cosmic consciousness, some sort of entity contact. They felt like religion and yet also did not feel like religion. And that was an important part. There was some way in which they had the tenor or the vibe or the structural character of traditional or classic religious experience, at least as we've come to think about it in the 20th century, after William James kind of made religious experience this thing that we think about and that becomes essential to religion, because you can definitely talk about religion and not talk about religious experience. But for modern Westerners, it's become like this very important category. And these guys were sort of doing that and sort of not. And the way in which they were not was partly because it often involved drugs, and drugs aren't religion. I mean, they overlap, but it's I think it's different to think of them as a different category of thing. So that was a whole element, but there was also a kind of pop cultural media consciousness, as if kind of McLuhan was lurking in the background, something about new media, about cybernetics, about the growth of networks around or pop culture or underground comics or FM radio or satellites. I mean, it was this era of analog media and the emergence of kind of digital networks around this 1960s, 1970s period also seemed to keep appearing within these visions that people were having. So when I decided that I didn't want to solely focus on Dick, it actually became really clear. I wanted to write about the 70s, and I wanted to write about multiple experiences and to show how they had these shared features, to allow those features to resonate, and then try to attempt to talk about why, like what connected these things. Why were they all happening at the same time? What is the secret sauce that links Robert Anton Wilson and Terence McKenna, Tim Leary and John Lilly and Philip K. Dick, all kind of West Coast figures, and there's more to mention. So that was a really clear project, and I didn't end up doing as many of these experiences as I had hoped, because once I started writing about Terence McKenna and Robert Anton Wilson, I realized that there's very little scholarly writing about them, like very little, just a few essays here and there, basically, and which kind of blew my mind. I mean, what important characters in different ways. Terence was already becoming a little bit more talked about because he's formed such an important kind of framework of thoughts and ideas more recently, in the 1990s into the 2000s. Of course, he's still influential today because people still listen to his hypnotic raps and rants. And so, there was some stuff there. But Robert Anton Wilson, who in some ways is, I think, intellectually the most interesting of these guys, it's at least philosophically the most coherent, and in some ways the most resonant for our era. There's very little writing about him, very little acknowledgement. There's very little sense outside of the people who were already Robert Anton Wilson fans that Robert Anton Wilson was worth reading and hanging out with. And that, again, I kind of wanted to rectify. So by combining those guys with Philip K. Dick and then writing about the 70s and some of these ideas about what links them with technology and changes in culture and communication, that ended up being High Weirdness. And I'm so glad that I did it. It's so much more satisfying a project, I think, because it invites you into not just these amazing individual stories, but it forces you to start thinking about what would connect them. Is it just that they were living at the same time in the same place, and these were sort of ambient forces? But if they were just ambient forces, why would they appear so intensely in the middle, in the core of these experiences, especially something like extraterrestrial intelligence? Why extraterrestrial? Why couldn't it have been, some ancient god pantheon from India or something? Even though those elements were there as well, there was something about the changes in technology and the loops between media and culture and consciousness that I think they were mobilizing or tapping into, the way that you can think of like Pound's idea that poets are the antenna of the race. I think psychonauts are a different kind of antenna. And maybe they tune into the future, but they certainly tune into patterns of experience that go deeper than our consciousness. And so by looking at, especially when they're articulate and well-read, like all three of these guys were, when you look at them in that framework, they become kind of like palimpsests or like spore prints of the zeitgeist. So it's a very rich way of approaching some of these ideas, and I'm really happy the book came out the way it did. And, so it's been very interesting to hit the road, talk about the book, talk about High Weirdness. And it's funny, it's like I'm already getting some really interesting questions that I don't know the answer to. One of the ones that keeps coming up, which I talk about a little in the book, but the more I think about it, the more unclear I am really about it, is how does this idea of the 70s weird, the kind of weirdness that lies at the heart of all of these different experiences, alongside religion, alongside psychedelic philosophy, there's this sense of the weird, sort of a little disturbing, a little crazy, or more than a little crazy. As much pop culture as mysticism, even kind of garish elements of pop culture. And here's the great example is when Terrence, who never was into UFOs, always thought people who were into UFOs were crazy and being manipulated by intelligence agencies and not really worth any effort. Nonetheless, he saw a UFO, of course, in during his experiences in La Chorrera. But he makes the point that the UFO directly resembled hoax photographs of UFOs that were famously hoaxed from the 1950s. And so this was a very strange but very interesting idea that, like, even if whatever intelligence or unconscious forces lay behind the surface phenomenology of a trip, whatever part of you that would say, okay, now we're going to make a UFO happen inside your mind stream, that the fact that UFO would then be obviously fake or referring to a fake UFO sort of points to these deeper loops about the weird and about how cultural scripts engineer our experience, but also leave gaps and cracks in those phenomena, and almost as a way to kind of remind us that they're just the surface of something else, that's not the whole story. And I think that's a very rich way of approaching psychedelic experience that we see far too little of, actually, where it's not that the visions themselves aren't important, but they're not the whole story. And in fact, part of the story is the way in which they're insufficient, or a way in which they point beyond themselves, or point back to you, but in a circuitous way that becomes challenging to think about, and yet in that very challenge opens up to some of these larger questions about culture and consciousness and even politics. So that's sort of an element of the weird. But the question then is, what about now? Is weirdness still weird? And it's a really good one, because we're at this place where, as I say too often in the show, all of these relatively marginal discourses and fields of experience and individuals and cultural producers and attitudes, perspectives are more and more visibly woven into, I don't want to say the mainstream, because there's not a mainstream, but are just very visible and accessible to lots and lots of people. And they're just kind of part of this endless horizontal surface of possible reference and possible orientation that the internet and our current, kind of moment of like cultural hyperproduction have given us. So in that space, is there weird? Well, sure. R. Crumb is there. UFOs are there. Lovecraft is everywhere. And Lovecraft is a key feature of the weird, not just in terms of being a writer of weird fiction, but of someone who helped set in motion or helped articulate the way that the tension between truth and fiction is part of the mechanism of the weird. And of course, that mechanism is now taken off in some very alarming ways in our current media environment. And, once we start having videos that are concocted and deep fake videos and tough to track, and that's already happening. I mean, things are only going to get more and more surreal, more and more weaponized, more and more confusing. The fog of war will become the status quo of information processing. I mean, I'm sorry to say it. I don't think there's a way out of that kind of thing. So in some sense, there's more and more of the stuff, and yet at the same time, there's a sense that the edginess or the sort of outsider quality of the weird, the subcultural force of it, even the kind of shockingness of it is dissipated. So what's really weird then? I mean, if everybody has a tattoo, tattoos aren't weird. Even if you look at the tattoo and it's a rat fink from, Big Daddy Roth from some car culture thing in the late 1950s, when stuff like that was only enjoyed by marginal people, by weirdos. By people that the society had decided were weirdos, and so they had some kind of other space of resistance or alterity that they were living in and kind of coming from. And now that it's just pervasive, that psychedelic imagery and ideas about psychedelics are kind of pervasive, and other things like this, then where's the weird? And I don't know the answer to that. I'm not really sure. I think the where I keep coming to is that there's something about the relationship between weirdness and the banal, and that part of what modern culture does is it banalizes, I don't guess that's how you pronounce it, things, and it renders material banal in its very reproduction, even as something that's exciting or novel or interesting. And that's sort of like an aspect of kind of consumer culture, of capitalism, where there's some edge, and in absorbing the edge or taking the energy from the edge in, it makes it more available. So in that sense, it's cool. But then in doing so, defangs it or renders it just another thing to do. One example from my book that's kind of a funny one is, in 1971, when the last Apollo mission went to the moon, they brought like a golf ball in a queue, and they were like hitting golf balls around the moon. And I'm like, to me, that like is just like a complete epitome of how we render things banal. You go to the moon. My God, you go to the moon and you hit a golf ball around. It's so corny. It's so dumb. And I mean, golf's fine, whatever. But there's something about that kind of tourist tackiness that seems to be a intrinsic part of modern culture. And so as explorers of the edge, or as psychonauts, as visionaries, as people taking spiritual practices seriously, taking our own altered states seriously, we also have to recognize that we're all part of a process that in some ways is rendering those things banal. And in fact, the game is to not acknowledge or recognize the way in which they're banal. So maybe the true weird has to do with really embracing the banal. And that doesn't just mean the ordinary everyday, where like, oh, it's this bowl of cereal one more time with the same cracked bowl and this dusty spoon that I've been doing. It's not just the ordinary or the banal in that sense. It's that the actual texture of everyday life now is weird. And it's weird in some very disturbing ways, because it's implicated in all these other historical changes: climate change, the rise of surveillance capitalism, the house of cards that's international finance, all of these things that are worrying so many of us and upsetting so many of us for so many good reasons. They're visible or stitched into the very fabric of the ordinary. And to my mind, that's where like the genuine weird is calling us. Because in order to engage these experiences, or not experiences, these situations with open eyes, we have to be willing to take on their disturbing character, their enchanted character, their irrational vibrations, if you will, and even their horror. And there's a very significant relationship between weird and horror as a genre, but also as a kind of aesthetic character. So to really embrace and engage the world that we are on a feeling level, and that's what aesthetics is. It's not just art. It's a feeling level, how it feels to be alive and present to our world as it is now, requires a passage through and even an embrace of the weird. Of the disturbing, the uncanny valley, the strangeness of even the very idea of artificial intelligence, the fact that all these mundane objects in our life, the plastic bottles that we use, are just, absolutely intimately related to the spread of microplastics throughout the oceans and entering into the food chains and our own bodies, and that we're just absolutely woven into all these processes that are deeply uncanny and strange and weird, as Tim Morton likes to talk about, and talked about it on this show a few years ago, that quality of the weird has to do with waking up to the reality of climate change, or the reality of the tremendous interdependence that determines and characterizes and shapes us. And it's something that a lot of the mainstream stories want us to ignore, or conventional Western ideas. We're individual selves, we're rational, we make decisions, we have dreams, we fulfill them, we have pleasures, we pursue them. And that sort of model of the ego as the driving element of modern culture is now like so rickety, and yet there's an anxiety around maintaining it that way. And that has drifted into a lot of the spiritual searching and psychedelic work, or whatever that I've talked about for so long, in the sense that it's still about this self that is improving itself, discovering itself as part of it's achieving something, it's going towards something. And that's such a seductive narrative, not just because it fits into whatever modern Western ideology, but because it prevents you from facing this creepy, disturbing, even apocalyptic sense of what it means to not just be that. I mean, we are that sometimes, making decisions, trying to improve ourselves, facing our fears, going through our spiritual process, having dreams, exploring altered states. But for me anyway, over time, it becomes more and more clear that all of that work is embedded in all these relations I choose, relations I have no choice but to acknowledge or accept, that I don't want to, the way in which I'm a product of history, a product of social systems. And we have to kind of do both. But I think that one way of really being okay, as much as we can be okay with it, but at least beginning to open up to the consequences of our interdependence and our links of responsibility and affect and plastics and food and all the ways in which we're woven into this very peculiar historical moment, that by cultivating and being okay with the weird, that we're able to go in there. Because the weird is kind of like, enchantment without utopia. Enchantment without the kind of religious idea of some final wonderland, or some, great encounter with the divine that suddenly bathes all existence with harmony and hope. And that while those things I think are woven into the world that I'm talking about, certainly woven into the experiences of the three dudes that I talk about, more importantly is a kind of enchantment or openness to alterity, otherness in its full sense, that has a more disturbing character, and disturbing because it's threatening to the ego, it's threatening to the humanist worldview, the human model of what's alive, what's not alive, what's good, what's bad, what's helpful for humans, what's not, that all those questions and lines get challenged as we embrace our, let's call it, post-human condition. And I don't mean post-human in like, let's become immortal and put ourselves in robot bodies and go out into the cosmos so that we can, slave away extracting rare earths from asteroids and enjoy the ride or something. I mean post-human in a way of like, what does it mean to no longer think in strictly humanist contexts, even as we go on being human? And that transition, which is a weird transition, my relationship to animals, my relationship to bacteria in my gut, my relationship to the unconscious, my relationship to the machines that increasingly track me and anticipate my own psychological phenomenology and try to nudge it. This is all very weird stuff. And so I really think of this as it can look on the surface like it's a bit, I don't know, reveling in the peculiar or the peculiar for its own sake. But I actually think the development of this sensibility is political. It has to do with the way in which we orient ourselves to the way the world is now, and also helps us orient ourselves to that continued existence of the outside, of what is beyond what we know, what is in the mind that strikes us as impossible, whether it be things that people lump under the category of the paranormal, or whether it be experiences and connections with non-human forms of intelligence or agency that people experience in their dreams, in their trips, even in their work with plants or animals or technologies for that matter. That the weird also is a way of keeping open to the other, and the other is also includes what we really just don't know, the cosmic other, the others that surround us invisibly. And so to be open to the building of an interface that almost by nature has to be uncomfortable, has to feel not quite right. Like, oh, this is a little bit off. This is a little too strange. This isn't going to help. This isn't going to clarify. This isn't going to help my achievement self continue to achieve. This isn't going to help my, my business, necessarily. Maybe it will, depending what your business is. But there's a deeper call towards the outside or the beyond, which is something that runs throughout High Weirdness, and that, I left purposefully undefined. And that's the kind of intellectual I am, where even though I'm very interested in systems and thought and analysis and critique and cultural context and, not taking the surface story to be the truth and, enjoying suspicion as a mode of analysis, that for all that, I also think it's incredibly important to keep the door open. You keep the door open for the other, for the conversational partner, for the inspiration you can't predict, for the weird encounter you can't wrap your head around, for possibilities, even utopian possibilities that we can't really perceive right now, and to stay open in that open-hearted way, not just ready for anything, but ready for good things, even in the midst of a situation where we're also called to encounter others that are more and more challenging for us, because they are participating in this moment of planetary human trauma that there's really that we're called upon to face, that is, in the classic sense of the term, as meaning fate, are weird. And so with that as a closing note, have a wonderful summer, and yes, keep your minds open.